Hi everyone, I'm Jim Rizoli with Diane King here. We are going to be interviewing Michele Renouf from, I don't know exactly where you live, but you live in England, so I know that. And she has an interesting background that we think people should hear about, especially dealing with our favorite topic, and that's the Holocaust issue. So Michele, welcome to our show. Nice to have you.
Very nice to be with you.
Well, we finally connected.
You fellow colonial, you.
2 years overdue, but it's glad that we finally connected.
Right. Well, we felt we've been wanting to interview you for a while because we feel that you're a very integral part of the movement here, and not many people know about you on this side of the fence anyway. So we think it's important. So what what I want to ask you basically is just some of your background and how what you came out of, what you did when you were younger and up to our point. Just kind of sum up a little bit about your life. I mean, you don't have to get too personal, but just some of the things that you happen to come through, and then we'll talk about how it relates to our topic here. So if you'd like to talk, I mean, I always like to have people talk, let them do most of the talking. If you can, do that, that's fine. And if we have questions, we'll just ask you some questions on the way. How's that sound?
Yes, very well. Okay, so to start with, I was born in 1946 in one of Britain's former colonies in Australia, on the southeast coast of Australia. I lived there till aged 10 because my father's parents happened to have an hotel there overlooking the Pacific Ocean, and that's why we were also living there. And let me think. Well, my father was a former aerial reconnaissance photographer during the Korean War, and he had many careers himself in consequence of that. But I spent most of pretty much every weekend from age 3 until age 10, either in Newcastle or Sydney, the two nearest cities, because my mother was mad on classical ballet. In fact, she made and designed ballet costumes. And she took me every Friday. I only went to school 4 days a week in primary school, 4 days a week in school, and every weekend from Friday to Sunday in the city learning classical ballet. The Ballet Russe came to Australia some decades before that, and so she was the top ballet teacher. And I have often said that I think people, our people, even our activists, I sometimes pull their leg by saying they have had insufficient classical ballet training because it forms one's self-criticism. And it's, of course, very character building. It's very helpful for withstanding the onslaught that we do experience when we want to query Holocaustianity and the Hollywood narrative. So that classical ballet training has stood me in good stead. Now, during that period, as I happened to be in Sydney on one of these ballet training occasions, I was walking through, and this is a very relevant part to what we're speaking of, or we will be speaking of, is that I happened to be walking through a very big department store, and someone spotted me and asked my mother if they could use me for an advertisement for Fairy on the Christmas Tree or some other thing of this sort, to sell soap, or I forget now what it was. So that was the beginning of my becoming what really one might describe as a propaganda tool. I became a photographic model at age 7 or 8 or thereabouts, by chance. I was at that time, during my childhood, never with a model agency, but it was just because my mother was not keen at all on my doing that. She wanted me to be seriously trained as a ballet dancer. She often said she wanted to inculcate into me qualities that other girls do not have. And of course I used to say, well, they're bleeding toes and, low morale and the usual sorts of things that are involved with classical ballet training. So nevertheless, photographic modeling and acting in television commercials, which I then did from age 15, again by chance, had been something that I had done from childhood until, well, I would be doing it till the present day, but for our predator who stepped in to stop my career.
Huh.
But that training, that experience in the mis-selling and mispackaging of products is extremely relevant to what we are engaged in at this moment, because it taught me indirectly about the skills of a predator, and that, curiously enough, that expertise in advertising has been the one thing that helped me understand, in many cases better than a lot of scientists, how our predator operates. And I'll come to Professor Kevin MacDonald later on, because it's to them that I'm referring here. So what shall I say to you now?
Well, let me ask you. I have some questions. Don't worry. All right. So here you are. Now, what the time period was? Let's see, the 60s, right? Late.
Yeah. Well,
the late 50s and early 60s, right? You're doing commercials.
Yes, that's right. Yes. So
okay.
Yes, and yes, and then eventually I did some television shows when I went to Queensland. Well, I mean, when I graduated from high school, I won a scholarship to art school, 4 years. Then I did a degree in education, so I had the equivalent of a BA. I then lectured in fine arts, which was my training, at what eventually became the Queensland University of Technology. And at that time, because of the sort of 1968, I think it was part of as it happens in my case, it was 1969, but I think I may have been part of this 1968 disaster that befell us, that your listeners probably know quite a bit about, where I was permitted to, at that university, to begin what would have been called media studies, but that phrase was not known to me or to them at the time. It was simply because I saw the opportunity of putting together the idea of English literature, which is my secondary subject, with my expertise in advertising, because I had just read The Hidden Persuaders by Vance Packard. Now, you may be familiar with that book, and if not, it's really quite an important little book, because it began to explain to us how political ideas, how other ideas are sold to us via the invisible hand of persuasion in advertising, the hidden persuaders.
I do have a question for you, though. Let me ask you, just so we can put this all in perspective. What type of commercials were you doing? I mean, the commercials that you were doing and the movie stuff on the TV, what you were doing? What particularly were those things?
Well, at that time, I was we had a chap in Queensland who was the Australia's sort of Danny Kaye.
Okay.
And I was his sidekick, as it were. So I did a lot of comedy acts with him.
Right.
As a consequence of acting in television commercials, normal products, the usual sorts of products. And that's how that occurred, because earlier on, I was what you might call Australia's Shirley Temple. As when I was saying to you when we began, before we came on air, you said you'd like me to answer questions. And I said, well, so long as you're not wanting me to sing and tap dance like I used to do on the radio. So, I was very much involved with media, really.
Okay. So you were kind of well known then, right? Out your way.
Yes, in a sort of a sense. That's why I've never sought publicity. I've always had publicity.
Right. Right.
In all sorts of ways. So anyway, I introduced into the syllabus that I was running with my students at the university what was not called media studies, but in fact was media studies. And I used Vance Packard's book and my experience in advertising, plus using Shakespeare. And in particular, in Hamlet, there's a discussion between Laertes and Polonius, in which the older man is telling the younger man how to besport himself in the courts, how not to overdress, not to use too many gestures, how to conduct himself, how to sell himself, how to package himself, and how to sell himself. And I use this in a way of describing how Shakespeare was also was exposing the hidden persuasions in some. So, but it was not political. I was not at all exposed to politics. In fact, I was kept, for classical ballet training at that time, the idea was to be unworldly, very unworldly. It was a quasi-religious training. When we were and it's all related to what we are doing in our discussion as time goes by, as we get into the topic. You'll see the relevance, because from say age 6, in our dressing rooms, we were told there were microphones. Now, whether they were or not is not the point. The issue is that there were microphones in the rooms to catch us out as 6-year-olds. If we were talking about going to the beach, you see, bear in mind that I'm born in an area where beach is the most ordinary thing in the world, or anything else other than preparing our mind mentally for our ballet lesson. From age 6, I'm talking, and very seriously, so that when we walked into the ballet room, our minds had to be focused on the faults that we were going to have described to us. We had to keep a fault book of what was wrong, and if we were in any way looking at somebody else who was being bawled out, we were told to mind our own business and to concentrate on how we were going to improve ourselves. It was very much it was a quasi-religious kind of an upbringing, I would say. My teacher was Roman Catholic. I think there would have been some influence there in her methods that were quite severe. The training was very harsh. But as I said, it has stood me in good stead, considering the harsh treatments that I have experienced, as so many people who want to take an interest in historical revisionism.
Right. So this education was because of, it was like a religious type of group running it. Is that what it was?
No, not at all. I'm misleading you there. I mean, the teacher happened to be Roman Catholic, so I just say,
okay. Right.
I just say that there would have been a certain amount of influence there of her particular.
But it was like a cult, essentially, a cult of classical ballet cult.
Right.
Yes, but the classical ballet training, especially at that time, was a very, very disciplined. Well, I guess it is still now, very disciplined and very character building, because it's very, very tough training.
Sure, yeah.
And so, and of course later on, when I'd skip ahead in that case, I then eventually came to England to complete my ballet training at the Royal Academy Academy of Dancing, which was in Knightsbridge at the time, in a wonderful building which is now gone, to do a licentiateship in choreography and so on. And that was in 1973, I think, when I was doing that in England. Now, where shall I go from there?
So here we are now, 1973, and how does this all now tie in with because you said you had problems, especially when you were coming to a knowledge of the topic we're going to be talking about here. So, did that come into play right there? Were you ostracized at that point? Well, first of all, I got to back up. You must have been taken in some sort of knowledge of these things, to make you make a decision, right? Another on the topic, were you Holocaust topic at the time, or whatever topic?
No, not at all. Not at that stage. Not at all. As I say, no political interest. In fact, it was a sort of one we had to be ethereal, not worldly, and that still carried over to that stage. But by that time, I had married a Russian who was a psychiatrist and one of the very few Gentile psychoanalysts, which of course is relevant to the topic, because indirectly I had a lot of influence from him about psychology, which of course again is very much related to advertising, and so during that period, when I was studying at the Royal Academy, we had to write a thesis on an area, and I chose the 1930s period of ballet, when I said, and I perhaps under the influence of my husband and his training, that ballet perhaps went from its early years into a sort of an adolescence, where it then started creating interest in psychological ballets. And so my thesis was written on this. But when I presented it to the examiners, they said that psychology has nothing to do with ballet and nothing to do with anything they wanted to have any interest in, and they rather rejected this thesis. And then I wondered what on earth, since I had been a teacher and a lecturer myself, I was concerned that here was a group of people who were themselves wishing to be unworldly, to the extent that they had closed their eyes to what education is supposed to be all about. And it wasn't until much later that I became aware of the guidelines for teaching about the Holocaust in schools. And it was because of my own background as a teacher that I was horrified by the guidelines. But again, that came much later. So I would say from that period until when would I say it would be, until I, now where would I say that I got those ideas?
Right, that's important. Where did, so in other words, the early 70s that we're dealing with now we're coming up to the 80s. And so I mean, this is just my thinking, because I don't know anything about you, but it seems to me you must have come into your enlightenment around the 80s, I would think.
No.
Okay.
I'm trying to rack my brain to think whether there was any other kinds of influence coming in, but there wasn't, you see. I had no experience of Jews. I'd never heard of Jews in my upbringing. In fact, the word kike I had heard of as a child, but I thought it related to Roman Catholics because I had never heard of Jews. So I had no preconception of Jews or influence. And even at that stage, I had none. And even though I just married a psychoanalyst, well, he was a trainee at that stage, still I did not understand or know anything about Jewishness. It was really only in 1995, I think it was, that I had any idea of an awakening about Jewish behavior. And that came as a consequence of my being invited on the Shakespeare's advisory board, because they were trying to, Sam Wanamaker at that time was trying to reconstruct the Globe Theatre on London's Bankside. And because I had done landscape design, I had had many careers since during, but all related to art and ballet and so on. But I had done this landscape design, and they had invited me onto the advisory board. And they said, this year, we want you to be running the major fundraising event. They said they had already decided that it was going to be for 100 people. It was going to be in a private house. It was going to be over this woman's swimming pool. Indoor swimming pool. They could put a big flooring across there, and it would take 100 people. The ticket was going to be £200 to £500 per person, which at that time was extremely high. It's high now, but it was very, very high at that time. And I was to go ahead with it. And I said, well, I have all my life worked for charity. Either I've performed as a ballet dancer, or I have, I was Miss Radio 2 HD. I was all sorts of things for fundraising, and later on, I had become a chairwoman for fundraising. So I said, in my experience, we normally give rubber chicken because it's the cheapest food. Rubber chicken is the cheapest food, where if you want to raise more money, you have to give them the most economic dinner. I said, and I'm certainly not going to try to sell what I would always describe as rubber chicken, the way it's cooked, expect people to pay £500 for it. I said, well, I have to devise some way of making it sort of more elite, more special. So I said to the Ivy, who were the top caterers in London at that time, because I was living in London, what would you suggest for a Shakespearean Elizabethan feast? And they said, well, suckling pig is, the Elizabethan thing. Then you should have a good vegetarian and perhaps a nice fish dish. So I said, well, the choice is what I want, because at least people feel that they're getting something for their choice. So I went back to my 25-strong committee, which I called my coterie. They were all specially hand-picked from either because they had influence or because they had funds, money that could help me draw the right sort of people to pay that sort of money for this charity. One woman got quite hysterical all of a sudden, out of the blue. And she said, there has never been a choice given in a charity event. And if you are going to offer a choice, we are going to regard you as a tyrant, and we are going to resign. I am going to resign.
Oh,
and I said, but Wilma, normally, if you're a tyrant, you're not giving a choice. Now, what actually is the problem that you're having here? Because it's not even my menu. It is the Ivy's menu. I'm not so interested in cooking and food. She said, because you can't expect Jews to sit at a table where other people may be eating the pork option.
Oh.
And I said, you're beginning to get the picture?
Yeah.
So,
I got the picture a minute or two ago. So.
Yeah.
I thought you might have done. I thought you may have done, yes.
Yeah.
But you can see what, the long preamble I've given you of my background is just to show you that I had absolutely no experience of Jews or had even known about them in my upbringing. And certainly even when I married a psychoanalyst, I knew Freud was a Jew, but it didn't mean a thing to me. In fact, Wilma, the woman that I'm talking about, was a Jewess. And I had eggs and bacon with her, in the past. And even that didn't strike me particularly. Well, and it's her business. So for me, if she wanted to protect Jewish interests, even though she herself would eat pork, I would regard as her business. However, it was this extraordinary reaction from the other people that was the most interesting to me, because she said, well, if you're going to persist in giving me, we're having to have a choice, we are going to regard you as an anti-Semite. And
jeez.
That's a stretch.
Oh boy.
right. And with that, she got up and she went to the back of the room where the coffee had been laid out in this private room. And the rest of the 23 people got up and went with her.
Wow.
And I was left sitting there wondering what on earth is going on.
That's right.
Oh boy.
So I said, but you know, we're talking about food here.
Right.
What is it talking about anti-Semitism? What is that? You know, I'd heard about it in high school, but hadn't paid any attention. Right. So all these people, they were educators. They were influential people. They were not, you know, people of no thinking consequence.
Right.
These were influential, highly placed people in London society for one reason or another. And they all got up in terror that this woman had accused me of anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism is not what they wanted to have anything to do with, and they went to the back of the room with her. Now, that fascinated me. Now, I have to say that people, the event went ahead, and I raised £50,000, which was a lot of money at that time. £50,000 was an enormous amount of money in that time, to build what was called the Wardrobe of Robes room at the Globe. You can see it now. It's at the back, it's behind the stage, where they, as it happens, they make the costumes. So in a sort of a way, it was my little private homage to my mother, really, who also made costumes, and I appreciated costume and presentation, which is part of the advertising packaging, so well through her. So trompe-l'oeil and all these tricks of the eye. So the event and people had afterwards said, well, you won. I said, well, I didn't regard myself as having won anything. I lost someone off my committee through an absurd idea, which should never have occurred. And that was seemingly the end of that, until 2 weeks after that, by chance, a Georgian prince of the Russian Georgian style, I happened to know him, and he said, look, I have a ticket to Bayreuth, to Wagner's festival, the opera festival in Bayreuth in Germany. My wife used to go, but she's now, I've lost my wife, she's died now, and I would like to offer it to you. Would you like to come? And I said, well, you know, I have some interest in Wagner. I don't know too much about Wagner, but I'd certainly love to have, this is a hen's teeth ticket. People have to queue for years to get in. So I went along there, and during the interval, a young Greek boy had these leaflets that he was giving us, sitting at the table. We were at a table with a very prominent Greek family. And the leaflet was about Wagner, the anti-Semite. Was Wagner a dangerous artist? And the Netherlands University was going to have this conference on Wagner, the anti-Semite. And I said, well, how interesting. I had no idea that I had something in common with Richard Wagner, because apparently I am an anti-Semite. I'd love to know a little bit more about this anti-Semitism. I certainly know it's terribly tyrannical, because had, you see, Wilma not given me that important word, that's why words are so important, and that's why advertising and the skill of the Jew is so related to the narrative and the word and the definition, because this is how you can swindle. And so I thought, I will find out what this anti-Semitism is, and so I went along there. And it was exactly the same situation as I had encountered with my little coterie. When I got up to the microphone, we were all invited to, you know, if you wanted to ask a question, as one does at conferences. I went up to the microphone and I said, look, I've been listening. I said, I'm quite aware now that Wagner in his prose works was exceedingly anti-Jewish. He was highly critical. But in his artworks of the future, which is what he called his operas, I see nothing anti-Jewish there. I see universal principles, which is what an artist must achieve. He has to he has to purge himself of the particular to reach the universal, which is what art must do. So I said, where, therefore, is this anti-Semitism, this anti-Jewishness of Wagner's in his actual work, as opposed to his private thinking? Well, I got the same frightened behavior at a university. After all, myself, as I say, I had been a university teacher. I respect open debate. This is what I have grown up to understand and project myself to my own students. And here I was encountering university lecturers who were frightened to answer the question sensibly. And eventually I got some murmurings about Beckmesser seeming to be like a Jew because he's bureaucratic and pedantic. He's the bureaucrat in the Meistersinger of Nuremberg. And then in the Wagner's Ring cycle, Mime, one of the characters there, he is supposed to be Jewish, but Mime is actually a Norwegian troll. He's not a Jew. So I said this, and there's a little theme, some small theme that rather suggests Jews. I said, well, that doesn't seem to be very significant or very substantial if we are going to regard Wagner, the artist, as opposed to the individual, the artist, as a dangerous anti-Semite, because I don't see any anti-Semitism in his work, and you don't appear to be either, if all you're talking about is two little trivia ideas. Well, the response was, as you can well imagine, of a lot of anger toward me. Whereas I had asked a perfectly reasonable question. If I'd been asking it about some other nation, I'd have had no trouble. So I got so interested in the fear. Again, it was the fear of the other people toward the subject. So I then started eating McDonald's food, quick food. This, I actually stopped shopping for food. I stopped everything. I just got every book I could find on what people had said about Wagner's anti-Semitism and what he himself had said about Jews. Now, I can't read German, so of course I had to rely upon translations. But I totally blocked out the entire world and ate as fast, just refueled as fast as possible, and completely went into this. And then I produced a monograph called Judaism and Wagner, Inspirational or Conspiratorial. And because I'd been to art school, I'd made the book, it was self-published. I'd made it into a little book. I put on the cover a picture of Siegfried, one of the main characters in The Ring, lying under a tree with the dappled light on the forest ground. And because, again, as I'd been to art school for 4 years, I thought, I think I'll make the pages yellow to go with the dappled light. It was like it was a little art book. And so when I heard that there was the Arizona Opera at the University of Arizona were putting on Wagner's Ring and a conference, and they were inviting books on the subject, I thought I will take my little 100-page monograph along to the bookstand there, to which I was invited to put my little 100-page book. Very soon after that book had been put on the book table, I had a call from the director of the Arizona Opera House. He said, look, we're terribly embarrassed, but we've had an awful call from someone who is complaining about your book. I said, well, what are they complaining about? They said, well, the yellow pages. I said, well, you're getting it over.
I know where this is going.
You know where you're going. because he said the yellow pages remind him, wait for it. Do
know.
I need to tell you about the
Yellow Star? Yeah.
The Jews had world during World War II. This upset his sensibilities.
Oh,
And furthermore, he didn't like the title. He hadn't read the book, by the way. He just didn't like the title, Judaism and conspiratorial in the same title. You can't have that in the same sentence. And furthermore, if that book was not 100 pages, wasn't going to be removed from the table at the Arizona University, he was going to burn down the Opera House and give the company a bad anti-Semitic name.
Wow.
So I said to the director, I said, you know, I'm beginning to feel like Marlon Brando in The Godfather. Do you know, there's a scene there where he's gone to the police and the police haven't helped. So he's now gone to the Godfather. And the Godfather said, well, you went to the police. Why didn't you come to me in the first place? I said, well, you know, if the man is wanting to burn down the Opera House, wouldn't it be better to go to the police rather than to me? I mean, you know. So I said, look, I tell you what I'll do. I said, look, I'll take my book off the table for 2 days, during which time I want the academics of the university to read those 100 pages. It won't take long. And then you can decide whether you think it's, because my entire thesis argues that anti-Semitism is a propaganda tool. It's a term invented to give a creed, a vain and greedy creed, a fantasy of genetics. And that is actually part of my thesis. So I want some. So, of course, by this time, of course, all the people in the foyer are hearing about Benjamin the bully, who's carrying on in the foyer like crazy. Every time he sees me, he goes berserk. People, of course, had a look at the book, and they want to know what the hell's in this book. And whatever it is in this book, we have the Constitution. It's got to be on the table. We are Americans. We have this book back on the table. So in due course, the book goes back on the table, and people declare it is not anti-Semitic because it's arguing the term itself. With that, of course, Benjamin goes completely mad. Of course, I have all the time been trying to calm down Benjamin, rather than allowing him to carry on like that and bring the press, which would have made much more sense from my point of view as having written the book. That would be a good idea. I was, at that time, trying to placate this poor little Jew who was upset, you see. But in the end, when he's starting to threaten my life and making an enormous fuss, as you can well imagine, in the foyer, eventually the police came to arrest him rather than, as they probably would today, arrest me. So, but that's not the end of the story at all, because I left my 500 copies of this book for it to be distributed to all the Wagner societies worldwide.
Oh boy.
At that time, I did not know that every Wagner society worldwide is run by a Jew. I thought it would be run by Germans who would be interested in, because still at that time, I did not know about anything other than Judaism, you see. I'd studied Judaism because of this pork, because of the tyranny. So then I went away, and the book burning occurred, and then, well, of course, it's very unusual for me to be able to say to you that for 2 days, my book was banned in America. I thought nothing could be banned in America, and then later on, I become banned myself in Kentucky. And I'll tell you what, perhaps I mentioned that now, because what's the date? I think it was in Kentucky in 2013, the Show of Shows, run by, well, it's not run by Harry Cooper. It's a very big international show, and Harry books of Harry Cooper, of the Shark Hunters, the U-boat chap, who's, I'm sure you'll have heard of him. He had a table there, and he had announced that I would be coming to the table and people might like to meet me. I wasn't selling anything or doing anything or making anything. It was just going to be Lady Renouf coming to and if you'd like to meet her. That caused, well, I'll just get that up so I can read it to you, actually. It's in front of me here. It was the state of Kentucky controlled by Governor Steve Beshear and Jeremy and the Lieutenant Governor Jeremy Abramson has banned a British filmmaker, because I'll have to come to that later, and a free debate campaigner from visiting one of the state's longest running traditional events, the Show of Shows, staged in Louisville by the Iowa Valley Military Society in 2013. Abrahamson is the former mayor of Louisville and the most powerful politician in the city's history. Yet citizens had traditionally believed that even the most powerful Americans accepted their nation's constitution. Unlike European countries, where historians and scientists and researchers are often jailed for normal historical revisionism of once accepted orthodoxy, Jeffersonian America was renowned as the home of the free. But the little brochure that we produced in consequence remarks, but as George Orwell perceived, some are more equal than others, and some are certainly more free than others to impose their own politically correct versions of quote unquote history. So here was, but that was rather later. That was rather later, but immediately after this episode, in just going back now to the episode in Arizona, I then went and wrote a little piece more about this for the book and enlarged my little book into a hard copy, and then I took it to Australia, to the Adelaide Institute, where they were having because I thought I wanted to I was really using my monograph as a means to get people's opinion on my thesis. And there I had the luck of meeting Dr. Frederick Tobin.
Okay, there you go.
Yes.
There's the tie right there. We found the tie.
But not yet. Not really yet. Because even at that stage, I'd never heard of revisionism or any David Irving or anything. I'd taken no interest in the Holocaust. But my thesis had said, if you're going to call something a Holocaust, someone has to have given it. Who offered this sacrificial burnt offering? Now, that was all my thesis. That was one of the keys to my thesis, who offered it. You see, that was what so anyway, I go to the thing in an Adelaide Festival, and at one of the conference events, I get up and ask a question. Tobin hears me, my question. He comes over and introduces himself and says hello. He said, "Oh, I'd love to have some of these copies of your book. I'll try and sell them for you." He never mentioned about revisionism at that point. Just Wagner, you see, and Judaism. So it was. So we're talking about now, I think, 1978 or 79 now. Is it?
Well,
so nothing happens. Nothing much happens after that until I read. No, 98. Sorry. So in 2000, I see in the Times newspaper in London something about the British historian David Irving, and it quotes where he says, if he was a Jew, he wouldn't be asking who pulled the trigger, but why. And I thought, gosh, here's an historian who's taking someone, a Jewish historian, Deborah Lipstadt, as a civil action in the High Court in London, and is asking the question about Judaism as to why, and the Holocaust about to why. And I thought, well, you know, we've practically all been in those chambers. We've practically all had the shower with the gas coming down. We all experienced all this in 1,000 different Hollywood films. He must be a bit of a nut, thought I. However, he's asking the question that my little modest monograph has asked. Why? So I thought, well, let's go along there and just see if there's anything to be had here. And I experienced and saw and witnessed the very opposite of what I had expected. I saw all these people on the left-hand side of the court with their laptops connected to Israel, to Spielberg supporting it all, to all these people, enormous plethora of support here. And on the other side, I saw only David Irving on his own, doing his own defense and so on. And I heard their side just slandering him and insulting him, as opposed to his side, where he was producing documentary evidence and arguing in a rational tone. And I thought, isn't this the opposite of what I've been to understand? So I thought, I'm just going to stick around here. But sometimes I couldn't get into the courtroom. It was small and packed out with the usual people. So one lunchtime, I'm downstairs in the canteen at the court, and behind me stands David Irving, who recognizes me from having been in there. And he says, well, what did you think of this morning's session? I said, well, I couldn't get in because it was so packed. He said, well, you see how empty my benches are? Why don't you come and sit in my benches? Feel free. I said, well, great. That means I can come in every day because it doesn't seem like anybody wants to sit there. Later on, why no one wants to sit there. And I stayed for the duration, which was about 2 months.
Wow.
And at the end of that, where I was absolutely astonished by what I was hearing and seeing. So at the end of this, they have the judgment. And for the judgment, they go into a wonderful big, the court, the room that was used for Irving was just a rather side, ordinary room, like an office almost, practically. That was why it was so small. Mm-hmm. But for the judgment, they had the wonderful wooden carved building. It was just a magnificent room, rather like the one that they do use in the film Denial, the one that's out now about the Lipstadt trial, in which, by the way, I can see that they have included a figure such as myself, since I was there every day, because there's a woman there who sits with a pale blue suit, and she's still in that pale blue suit for 3 months of the trial, actually. But the hairstyle is the same as mine was at that time. So it's a bit of an in-joke, I think, with them, because they did rather use me as a bit of an in-joke, because I didn't sit there to be taken notice of, but of course, obviously, I was taken notice of. So at the judgment, I happened to find myself sandwiched between Professor Van Pelt, who was one of the defense experts. He's actually certainly included in this film Denial with Deborah Lipstadt's trial. So he's sitting on one side of me, and the other side is the representative of Mishcon de Rea, which was the top legal team that defended Lipstadt, but who would not let Lipstadt go on the witness stand. And of course, I already knew, since I'd been studying Judaism, why they didn't want her to go there. And of course, Irving also knew that because of the Kol Nidra prayer, which I'm sure your listeners are well aware. And would you like me to read that? Because it says, the Kol Nidra prayer is based on the Babylonian Talmud, the law books by which the Jews understand Judaism, and its tractate Nedarim, I don't know how to pronounce that terribly well, 23a and 23b, quote, and he who deserves that none of his vows made during the year, and he who desires that none of his vows made during the year shall be valid, let him stand at the beginning of the year and declare, every vow which I make in the future will be null, end quote. Now, we cannot concur with that kind of thinking, because that kind of thinking is counter to our Hellenic tradition of keeping a vow, intending to keep a vow, and what a vow is supposed to be about, which is why, when I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but why Disraeli was willing to put his hand on a Christian Bible to swear the oath in order to become a British Prime Minister, Rothschild was not. He would not swear on a Bible, the New Testament, because his well, certainly couldn't be trusted if he had, because of this Kol Nidra prayer, which is counter to any Hellenic tradition, let alone the Christian tradition or even the Muslim tradition. So that is the reason why they never let Lipstadt be cross-examined, not only because he would have caused her to say, what is the Kol Nidra prayer? And you, as a practitioner of Judaism, surely must recite this on every Yom Kippur, as a Jew must. And that is why they didn't let her. And also, the other reason why they wouldn't have let her is because of those stunningly magnificent trials, as you are very well aware, in Canada, of the late, great Ernst Zundel.
Right.
Because it's only in 1985, in the 1980s, when he succeeded, along with Professor Forresson and David Irving, actually, and certainly Michael Hoffman, and with the help of the battling barrister, as Robert Forresson called the late, great Douglas Christie, where they cross-examined the so-called eyewitnesses to what they saw as this extraordinarily unique mass murder weapon, and it was admitted by this, as you'll all be very well aware, by Weber, that he used poetic license for his testimony. And also that Dr. Raoul Hilberg said that he was at a loss because he could not produce any documents, counter to the claim that there are mountains of documents which prove this, that, and the other. He admitted on cross-examination that he knew of no documents. And so the organized jury, was certainly not going to allow that to ever happen again. There was to be no cross-examining of these witnesses. So anyway, so I'm sitting there on the Judgment Day, Mishcon de Reya and Van Pelt, turning the pages of the judgment that had been printed out, sitting there in front of me, as it was read out by the judge. I think they were hoping to convert me, you see, because that is one of the policies I have come to understand of the Jew. They will generally try to win you over by schmoozing you, flattering you, and drawing you to their side. And if they don't succeed in that, then of course they criminalize, demonize, and generally cause you to be ostracized, lose your job, your career, and so on and so on. We're all familiar with that technique. So afterwards, the Jewish Chronicle, who had noticed, of course, that I'd been sitting there and didn't care whether people wanted to criticize me, throw bats and balls at me or not, I couldn't have cared less. They said, what do you think of the judgment? I said, well, I'm most dissatisfied with it. And I said, for me, if your children, for example, were murdered, you, as the mother, may not wish to go to the court to hear about it. You may not want to read about it in the newspaper. This is understandable, that your sensibilities will wish you not to have to confront it, perhaps. However, you cannot stop due legal and judicial process. Something has to be examined. You have to find out whether these people were murdered, how they were murdered, if they were murdered, where's the victim, where are the bodies. As Ursula Haverbeck, the the stunning German elderly woman who says she has written to so many Jewish organizations to say, where precisely did this 6 million Jews die? Where exactly? Because where did the crime occur? If there's a crime, there has to be a place.
Right.
Where is it occurred? Because we are told, because of the success of these extraordinary revisionists like Robert Forresant and Ernst Zundel and Fred Leuchter and countless, they are countable people who have had the endurance and the tenacity to persist in the historical source criticism findings without exception, because that's what revisionism is. It's a process without exception. So that the plaques, the 20 plaques, as we know, in Auschwitz that commemorated 4 million victims, later on were removed and then replaced by 1.1 million. And even that figure has been queried. Mm-hmm. So here we have a situation where children in schools are learnt 6 minus 3 still equals 6. Mm-hmm. And so on. So
I have a question for you. I want to ask in regards to the trial, just to go back. Did you know Irving? Did you talk to him? Was that the first time you ever really?
Yes.
Okay. So what was your discussion with Irving, if you had one? What was going on there?
Well, I had never heard of Irving at all. I'd never taken an interest in history in particular, and certainly not the Holocaust, other than looking at the movies. So it's just simply because I saw what he'd read in the paper, what they'd quoted, you see, and that took me along. And of course, then I got to know Irving during the period, and I also got to know how frightened people were to speak to him. I mean, I met someone whose name I won't mention, who said, "Oh, Irving has just been attacking me." I was a total stranger to him. He turned to me, he said, "Irving is just attacking me because I wouldn't help him carry all his documents, had trolley loads of documents, into the court." He said he didn't turn up with a taxi. I said, "Well, I guess it's because you didn't want to be seen doing so, was it?" He said, "Yes, because if I'd been seen doing so, I'd have lost my job." I said, "Well, doesn't that seem to be the reason why we're all here? Why are we being tyrannized?" The word that the woman, Wilma, had given me at the Shakespeare Globe event, nothing to do with Jews. But she had said I was a tyrant for expecting people to sit at a table where others might be eating pork. We had to be respectful of the Jew and dietary conditions, whereas of course for Christians on Lent, they didn't expect you to give up what they're giving up. That's not the principle. So it's this word, as I come back to you, the word tyrant, that had been wrongly applied to me, but had been projected onto me from her own tyranny, which I understood was happening in Irving's situation, where people were too frightened to even help him bring the papers from the taxi into the building. Wow. This was, to me, this was extraordinary behavior. And so,
well, let me ask you this: in that situation there, would you say that you were really demonized after that trial? The worst?
And very much during so. But I do want to add something here. This is when I first had any knowledge of Kevin MacDonald, Professor Kevin MacDonald.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, and he was called as one of Irving's witnesses. I think it was a great pity, actually, that Irving did not call Professor Forresant and many others of this ilk, but at least he did call Kevin MacDonald. But, he was on the stand and cross-examined by Irving, because the other side didn't cross-examine him at all, because they didn't want to acknowledge anything that he would say. But he was on the stand so briefly that I could barely grasp the significance of Kevin MacDonald. In fact, I had lunch with both of them. I mean, Irving used to invite me to have lunch with him downstairs. Well, I think it was part of my use for Irving in that time, without intending to be, was a little bit like a release for a pressure cooker, because of the intense. I mean, I have to say that Irving is a phenomena. He really is a phenomena. You can criticize him in any number of ways. I mean, I certainly would criticize him in many ways, but to have witnessed how he conducted himself in that case was something breathtaking to watch. He didn't seem to have any sleep. Because he was defending himself, they deliberately inundated him at the end of the day with more and more papers, whereas in fact what he needed to do was to totally collapse and ready himself for another onslaught the following day. They were already bringing more trouble to him. I mean, it was very vicious, very, very vicious. And he managed that. And on top of that, he was taking his young daughter to school every morning. Wow. Because her mother, I think, has ME or something. I mean, she's been supposedly dying for the last 30 years of multiple sclerosis, but actually, wow. What I think she has is ME, where you sometimes your defense system causes you to have to lie down. You're very weak, but from time to time, not all the time. But anyway, so he had to take the child to school. Beforehand. I mean, the idea of going against this entire onslaught, this Jewish onslaught, which is what Professor Tony Martin, the black professor from Trinidad, whom I'd met him subsequently in one of Irving's conferences in Cincinnati, who talked about the Jewish onslaught in the slave trade.
Michele, can I ask you a question? What was my question? I forgot my question. Why weren't Farrason and you mentioned somebody else too? Why weren't they able to get on the stand? What happened there?
I don't know. I don't know. And of course, I wouldn't have known that they should have been until much, much later, because I'd never heard of Farrason at that stage. But in retrospect, I think it a pity. Now, I don't know why. That would be, I have no idea. I still don't know, but I just say it. I just throw that in. But I do say that I'd met Kevin MacDonald. That Irving didn't seem to make sufficient. It was very. MacDonald was very timid, it seemed to me, in the witness stand. His voice was low. Irving didn't seem to make much of it. And even though I'd had lunch with him in the canteen with them both. I knew nothing about it until I saw these pieces of paper left on the tables up there in the law court there, which would explain the purpose of Kevin MacDonald and what he did. And this was quite a revelation to me, and I wish I'd realized it when I was sitting opposite this very timid person, seemingly, in the court, because many of his views as expressed as a scientist, I had instinctively understood them for my monograph. Mm-hmm. And I dearly wish I'd had the chance. But now I would argue quite severely with Kevin MacDonald and with Greg Johnson, because I just read just recently last night, perhaps it's the subject of another talk that we should have, because I would like to go into, in depth, what Greg Johnson has to say about the Third Reich and Israel, because I think he is, well, of course, I'd agree with him in many certain respects, but certainly not in his attitude toward Israel, and the concept that Israel is an ethnocentric entity. It is infinitely more than an ethnocentric entity. It is not an example for other states, nationalist states, at all. But anyway, that's a bit of a bigger issue.
Well, let me ask you this question. Because I really didn't realize that you were at that trial, to be honest with you. I didn't. That hasn't been something that came to my mind. But since you were there, who testified in behalf of Irving on that trial? Besides Kevin. I mean, there must have been others, right?
Well, there were very few, actually. I would have to I mean, I really can't think of anybody else that comes to mind, to be
Okay, so
frank.
so basically he didn't really have many people in his corner. That's for
I mean,
sure.
he was doing it as a sole.
Right, right.
You know, I mean, I suppose that was part of his own campaign, part of his own persona, I suppose. But there's no taking it away from Irving from the point of view of the phenomenal action that he took there. I mean, truly phenomenal.
So you thought he did a great job defending himself then?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, and even the judge did. Even the judge had to admit that he did that. And but the problem is, you see, this is where it all comes. This is where these courts come a cropper. The same with Turban. You know, law courts are not about truth. Right. They've even told you they're not about truth. In the Turban case, we heard from the Supreme Court in Ontario that truth is not a defense. I mean, how clearly do we need it stated?
Wow.
Because, and I believe it's a consequence of this judgment of Solomon that we've all been brought up with, because we're all psychologically Christian, whether we like it, and I certainly don't, or not. We are psychologically Christian in our thinking, and I think it's because Irving, like so many other, like most of us, have this idea from Solomon that if you tell the court the truth, that is going to bring you justice.
Right.
The courts have absolutely zero to do with that. If you want to win in a court, you have to do like I learned from Dr. Herbert Schaller, the Austrian attorney who got Irving out of prison when he was imprisoned by the Austrians in 2006. I had a lot to do with looking after Irving's family, his website, and his. In fact, I rescued his copyrights from being sold, and that was just by chance. He rang me up from the prison in Austria, and a little bit going away from whatever we were talking about, but he rang me up and he said, you'll need to go over to look after my family while I'm in prison. I said, well, David, I hardly know you. I've met Bente, I've met Jessica, but I mean, you must know people a bit better than I, suited to doing that. I mean, what on earth? I mean, I knew him, but I didn't know him. You know, there must have been other people who were more in contact, I would have thought.
Well, it seemed like he trusted you. That's why he wanted you to do that. He didn't have many people he could trust at the time, I guess, huh?
Well, no, because I'd shown him my monograph. So I think, well, first of all, of course, I have to say, when I handed him my monograph and introduced myself to him, he said, well, you know, he said, you are too good. Clearly, you are German intelligence. You know, that was his first impression. I said, well, that would be exceedingly impressive of me, since I don't speak a word of German, regrettably. However, even the Germans, the professors at Heidelberg, because I've left that little part out too. Shortly after my monograph, one of the young professors at Heidelberg University had seen the monograph, thought my thesis was an original thesis, and he had asked me to participate in the Deutsche American Institute's conference on Wagner, where Nike Wagner, the granddaughter of Richard Wagner, and Horowitz and quite a lot of very distinguished people were speaking. So it was rather an honor for me to be invited there. Now, I always say that I am an open book, but too many footnotes. So I don't know where we're going with this.
Well, no. Let me just go back. Okay, so let's get back to Irving. We didn't cover this because you mentioned it, but you didn't say what happened. So Irving was in prison, right? In Austria, is that what you said, right?
Well, yes, he was in prison because 16 years ago, he had answered a honey trap. I mean, Irving was without a doubt a misogynist, and I mean that's a womanizer. That's clear, and so it's very easy for him to be trapped by a woman. You see, yeah. So this woman sidles up to him. Because I actually saw her in the trial. She was very much cloaked, but I nevertheless saw her. She was the communist reporter for a communist magazine, and undercover, she sidles up to Irving 16 years earlier than the 2006 and says to him, "What do you think about the witnesses to the Holocaust?" And he replies, in German, but in 10 words in German, that I think they are psychiatric cases, right? And this 10 words in German, because he speaks perfect German,
yeah.
In 10 words he uttered, meant that he was no longer welcome in Austria. You can't say that in Austria, you see.
Oh.
So he was banned from Austria, but that was 16 years before. So he thought these Olympiad, these dueling fraternities they have in Austria, apparently they had invited Irving to come and talk to them. This is 16 years later, and he thought, well, 16 years ago they had a fuss about me. They'll have forgotten by now. Any normal, rational person can't imagine that you're going to put someone in prison for 16 words he uttered 10 years ago, which were only an opinion. Yeah, I mean, we're talking normal behavior. So he goes there. Of course, he's arrested. He's tricked. They seize him, put him in prison for the 10 words, and I've just told you what the 10 words were.
Wow.
And after all, he's talking about the people who said the smoke changed in the chimneys when they were Hungarians, pink, blue, and all that kind of stuff. The limbs jumped in the buckets, and the geysers of blood out of the, and all these obviously totally psychiatric. I mean, I was married to a psychoanalyst. I mean, you don't have to be married to a psychoanalyst to appreciate that this has to come from a disturbed person. Okay. So, but that was on the basis that he was imprisoned. So he has a court case, and, Irving can be, well, he's no question that he is a genius. But the point of the thing is that, like so many geniuses I happen to have met with this way or that, they can be totally foolish in a way that we wouldn't dream of being so foolish. I mean, Irving behaved, he took a left-wing lawyer rather like a child would. A child puts its hands over its eyes and says, "You can't see me." Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Irving behaves like that. He thinks that he'd take a left-wing lawyer and the jury won't see him as a right-wing. I mean, what? So he takes this guy who clearly is a rat, and he loses his case. He doesn't defend him properly. I was there. I went there to Austria to witness this. I mean, you see, I got interested in witnessing all of this when I realized that in Germany, for these court cases, there's no transcript. It's all hot air and it goes. Wow. And I thought, but there's no documentary evidence of what these people have tried to produce. Whether they're right or wrong is immaterial. They have tried to put into the evidence for their clients the evidence that the client wishes to present to the court. But none of this is recorded for posterity. Wow. So I thought, well, I'll have to do this. I mean, later on, I'll perhaps go back to how I came to be lifelong, not only in front of a camera, but eventually behind it. So,
well, how long of a prison term did he get in that time?
Well, they gave him 3 years in the Austrian prison in Vienna for the 10 words he uttered 16 years ago. I'm telling you, that was the entire. He didn't hit anyone or spit on anybody or do anything. So eventually, of course, he had it was Dr. Herbert Schaller who did not take. See, I would say Dr. Herbert Schaller has got what I call classical ballet training. He takes an objective view about the situation. He doesn't say, I'm personally hurt because you've criticized me and I'm going to cry. He takes the objective view. Irving needs to get out of prison. And having been snubbed in the beginning when he offered his help, and Irving just snubbed him because he didn't want a right-wing lawyer to help him, nevertheless, Schaller, totally ignoring his personal slight, went to the prison and said, I will help you with the appeal. And he did, of course, because this is where Dr. Schaller knows how to try and deal with these Talmudic courts, which do not respect, like the Talmud we've just described, the Kol Nidre prayer, vows, oaths, truth, or justice. I mean, the midot, which is part of the Jewish way of arguing, which is not very well publicized either, does not need truth when it's arguing something. The midot method of Jewish argument does not involve itself any more than Judaism and Judaic thinking does in truth. What predatory organization is interested in truth? I mean, a wolf is not interested in telling Red Riding Hood, I'm going to go and eat your grandmother. He's going to just find out where the place is. And then a predator is not a friend.
Right.
He's not even an enemy.
So let me ask you. So were you there at that trial in Austria?
Yes,
Okay.
of course I was.
Okay,
I've been following these because I was been so astonished at what is. I could hardly believe. That's what took me. First of all, it was Ernst Zundel's trial in the beginning of the century there, but where I was actually as a house guest at the late great Joe Sobran's house in Washington, and he was telling me about Ernst Zundel and this habeas corpus trial. No secret trials, and I thought, these people, they must be crazy. What are they talking about, secret trials? We're living in this century. So I caught a train up to Canada to witness what was being told to me, and sure enough, there were these trials where Ernst Zundel was to be put in prison on the basis of trials where you didn't even know who brought the trial, what the accusations was, or anything else. Right. And that's what got me interested in these trials. And so,
okay, so your involvement. I just want to put this all in context. So, actually, before the Irving trial, you were involved with the Zundel trial, then, right?
Not with the Zundel trial in the 1980s. First, get an introduction to the Holocaust narrative through Irving's trial in 2000. Before that, I'd written a book. Before that, I'd written a monograph on Judaism.
Okay.
But I had accepted what they said about the Holocaust. I just had asked the question: if you call it that, someone has to have offered it. I want to know who's offered it. And now I do know who's offered it, and that's another matter. We'll speak of later. But so at that point, that's 2000. At that time, I'm reading for an MA at the University of London at Heathrop College, which is a Jesuit college, on the psychology of religion. During which time, by the way, when you're doing a university course, you can generally do a sort of sub thing, and I did a sub course on philosophy. And I'd just come back from one of Irving's sessions, you see. It was an afternoon, and this tutorial was going on about the lampshades and the Jewish soap and all this kind of thing in the philosophy, because I find that this topic of the Holocaust comes up in absolutely any field at all. And this woman, this lecturer, was going on about these things. I said, well, do you know, I've just attended a big trial in London where both sides of the debate on these things have agreed that these ideas are simply war propaganda, that Jews were not made into lampshades. They were not into shrunken heads. And even I found it difficult to understand that any German during that period would want to wash himself in Jewish fat. I mean, that was clearly a Jewish idea. Nowadays, of course, Germans love to wash themselves in anything that causes them to have a little stardust of, of something on them. But at that time, I doubted that one, because it just seemed to me to be colossal. So,
oh, jeez. Let me just say this about the soap. There was one Jewish woman.
Before I finish that, if you wouldn't mind, I just to say that because I said that, I was asked to leave the room.
Oh,
we're talking about a university where I've just been to the court, and this is what both sides of the debate. I've not given my opinion. I couldn't care less. I'm just saying what people do with their predator is their own business. Well, I'm just telling you what the court had decided. And they said, you are anti-Semitic, leave the room. I said, I'm not being one thing or another. I'm not concerned with one thing or another. I'm just telling you what I witnessed today. And I had to leave the room. So this is another thing that causes me to think, why are people so deranged at this topic?
That's a good term, deranged.
You tell me what you were about to tell me.
Oh, no. I was watching a video of the woman talking about the soap, and she says, I was using the soap that could have been made from my parents. And I just like, oh my God.
That isn't even the worst of it, that Rachel Hannon. Yeah. Did you know that there is someone going around saying that the Germans converted Jews into sausage and bologna and other sandwich meat?
Oh, jeez.
Can you imagine a German wanting to eat Jewish bologna?
Yeah, and sausage. Her name is Rachel Hannon.
And they do now. They very much do now. They absolutely imbibe it with their milk and their teachers in school. Speaking of which, well, first of all, I came across in Nice, in the crematorium, heaven's sake, the Friedhof. I can think of the German word, not the English word. The cemeteries in Nice. When you go in at one of the doorways, there's an enormous mausoleum to the Jewish soap. Someone should do something about that, because it's still commemorating Jewish soap that's been buried there. But just going back to the other thing, just recently, I was on a train going from Frankfurt to my property in Germany. And I'm sitting opposite a young woman, and I get chatting to her, and she says that she teaches politics in secondary school in Germany. And, of course, she teaches about the Holocaust. And what does she teach them about? The lampshades, the shrunken heads, and the soap. I said, well, do you know that I can tell you categorically that both sides of that debate, I have heard them in a court, and I can show you the transcript, because there's a transcript of it in England, that they both say this was not true. It's propaganda water. She said, I've never heard, I'm not, and she was really upset that I was telling her this. I said, well, please try to investigate, because they can't investigate in Germany. They can't. Wow. Everything you want, if I want to watch you, I can't possibly watch you in Germany.
Right.
You can't, and therefore not only do people not be able to see programs, even Jewish programs on the subject, they can't. But they don't even have what we can have, where you see the bar line and can go to other sources. So they don't indirectly or by accident come across any alternate ideas but Holocaustianity narrative.
Wow.
Hollywood, they don't, and they wouldn't have heard probably before until recently, when I was interviewed by absolute chance, because there was a television crew turned up outside my house in Germany, and I walked over to them. This television camera trained on me as I'm doing some gardening there, and I said, why have you come? And of course, because of that, I'd already started to be interviewed without intending to be. So without wishing to give an interview, I sort of did. And I said, the Holocaust that I am interested in is the literal one that happened on the German civilians by the evil British policymakers during World War II, which intended to target and make a Holocaust, a literal Holocaust, burning alive, making civilians human torches as their feet were stuck in the asphalt, so they couldn't even run because the asphalt had melted around their feet. They were human torches. That is a Holocaust, and that is what I'm interested to tell people about, because I've seen the documents about this in our British archive. And of course then the television team, of course, immediately have to ask me, they have to say, what about the Jews who were being, Holocausted in 1933? They know perfectly well that the Jews weren't being anything in 1933, but that's just a come on, which I did not answer. They then had to put, because they didn't get the response that they wanted, they had to end my comment on the television. Well, it was nationwide. ZDF is the nationwide program where I'm talking about what Holocaust I believe in and wish to examine, and I don't go into the other, because whatever happened to the Jews, they were not Holocausted. They never said that they were burnt alive. That's a Holocaust. Now, we like to use the words properly,
right?
And Germans should use that word because it belongs literally to what happened to 60 German towns and cities in Germany, because our Churchill said we're going to baste them like you do a chicken.
Wow.
We're going to baste them. And others who were in the war cabinet said, we are going to target these. We're going to goad Adolf Hitler into bombing our cities. Imagine, British cabinet are telling in their minutes that they are going to goad Adolf Hitler into bombing in Britain, Germans, English cities, because he does not want to. It's in the documents there, the British documents, because Adolf Hitler did not want to do that. But if you say to a German in Germany that the British regrettably started World War I and World War II, they get infuriated with you.
Michele, let me ask you a question before we leave that. Did that interview with you get on TV?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so nothing happened to you because of that?
Well, I said nothing about the Jews. I said only about the Germans.
Wow.
I spoke about the Germans. I was not interested to speak of anything else. And indeed, if I had, I would have a problem. Certainly, I have a lot of vandal problem, because on the day that Manfred Roeder, whose house I bought, and incidentally, that house is known worldwide as the Reichshof. House Riechberg was his house, and I bought it at his great pleading. It took me 2 years to be convinced by him to buy it, and then he died. So I'm stuck with it. I'm stuck with the Reichshof. It's funny. I don't know what my mother would say. She thought I was going to have an ethereal upbringing.
You're in the middle of it now.
With no worldly interests, and here I am owning the Reichshof. It's very strange how life goes. But on his death, even though Manfred was no longer living there, they came and smashed my windows, put graffiti all over it, because the newspapers there had goaded them into doing it by having front page and other page. They quoted me on what I say about Judaism. I couldn't pay them to put on a front page newspaper what I think about Judaism. They called me the Mother Teresa of the Holocaust deniers on the front page. This thing. The back page, on the page 2, these are all big color pictures, and the other side, of course, they're deriding me as a blot on the landscape, and brown, and I'm this, that, and the other. And then they put a map of how to get to my house.
Oh boy! Wow!
So even the head of the Terror Commission came to my door, and he said, "We expect trouble since they have incited people to come and attack you," clearly. And then, so on that day, that's when so when Ernst Zundel died, they came again and attacked me.
Wow.
Same reason. And because in that time, they had, just months before that, they'd had another more front page news, to which I had not given any, up to that point, of course, I had given no interviews, and I'd kept very quiet. I had not even told people that I had bought this property. I wanted to be there quietly. There's no point in. I've had plenty of publicity all my life. I don't need publicity. Right. I don't have an interest in it. 15 minutes of publicity that we're all supposed to be seeking, I've had it when I was age 3, so I don't need it. Yeah. So then they on the next count, when they put the front page news there on the regional wide newspaper, they put not only the map of how to get there, but the full address with the postcode, which is handy for the sat-nav, satellite, for your car. So again, people came and did some vandalizing there to commemorate Ernst Zundel's death.
Wow.
So
let me ask you about that now, okay? Because that's important. So we heard how you came in contact with the David Irving situation there. So now, how about you getting into your introduction with Zundel? Let's talk about that. That's a good place to start on that.
Well, as I say, I had not heard of Ernst Zundel at all. When I went to visit the late great Joseph Sobran in Washington, D.C., and the reason I met him at one of David Irving's Cincinnati conferences, where Joe was one of his speakers, and so that's where I met Joe. And then later on, I was invited to be a house guest at his place. And at that, I'm not sure where, it must have been 2002 or something of that sort. So he was telling me, or I was hearing of Ernst Zundel, and this case where you could have secret trials where people could put you in prison without your knowing who they were, what the evidence they'd brought against you, and I thought this is a witch hunt. We can't have witch hunters. This can't be right. Somebody's being exaggerating. I'm going to just go and check on this because I don't want silly things being said and people believing ridiculous things. So I got the bus all the way up from Washington, D.C. to Toronto in Canada.
Wow.
And I went to the trial. And there I met Paul Fromm, this wonderful veteran campaigner for free speech. I mean, I take my hat off to Paul Fromm. He's done a fantastic job and continues to do a fantastic job. In any case, I went to the trial and saw all this stuff, met Doug Christie and witnessed the lunacy of this whole thing. And then I visited Ernst Zundel in the Toronto Detention Centre, and where he was in isolation. I visited him with his orange Guantanamo Bay kind of outfit on. He was this person who was a lifelong pacifist, who had an opinion, who'd conducted trials, brought evidence, and here he was being treated with his toothbrush as considered a weapon that he might use, and kept on a stool outside his cell, and all this total mad nonsense. And I wanted to take him. It was Christmas time. Maybe it was the second time I visited. I can't recall. But in any case, it was Christmas time on this particular occasion. I can remember. I went there with Paul Fromm, and I took him a modest box of chocolates. And I wasn't allowed to give it. I said, but look, my second husband was Sir Francis Renouf. He, as it happens, was a New Zealander who was a lot older than I at the time, when I married in 1991, I think it was, and he had parachuted into Corinth and was immediately captured. And he spent the war 5 years in Bavaria, and where he said he'd been treated wonderfully by the Germans. He was even able to do a correspondence course at Oxford, correspondence course. He was able to build a tennis court, and they're able to get. But the point I'm making is that he was able to get food parcels and treats from the Red Cross as a prisoner of war.
Wow.
The Germans permitted all of this, whereas here was Ernst Zundel, a pacifist, hadn't been commissioned to kill anybody. After all, my husband was a soldier. He was supposed to be killing the Germans. That was his purpose. But Ernst Zundel had never wished to kill anybody, and certainly hadn't and he wasn't allowed a box of chocolates. I said, even the Red Cross, the Germans, the wicked Germans, allowed. So, you know, again, so this is where I met Ernst. And then later on, when they kidnapped him, your listeners will probably know all about that, where they kidnapped Ernst, took him to Mannheim prison, and I used to visit him in Mannheim prison when he was there. Every year I had been invited I got to know through that prince, a Georgian prince that I was telling you about, who took me first of all to the Wagner Festival. I got to know Wolfgang and Gudrun Wagner. He was the grandson of the composer, and you know, they liked my monograph, and I was my great joy is to recall that in the kiosk at the Bayreuth Festival, my little modest monograph was being sold there. So to me, this was just wonderful. In any case, these people always invited me to one of the interval suppers, because, you know, in the Wagner operas, they're very long. So between acts, there's a break. Usually people have their first course and their second course, that sort of thing. And so I was always very honored to be not only invited, but Wolfgang Wagner either sat me on his right or his left, which is the two honored places at the dinner table, at these events. Now, apart from bragging about that, what was my actual, where was I really going?
Well, we left off when you went,
bragging about.
You went to visit Zundel in Mannheim prison.
Right. So every year I went to the Bayreuth Festival, and after that, it's in the summer, after that I took the 4-hour train down to Mannheim to visit Ernst. And later on, when he came out of prison, he said, you used to visit me more often when I was in prison than when I'm out, because so I got to know him quite well. And I used to, when I'd visit him, I'd ring up his wife, Ingrid, whom I admire enormously, and I'd say, you know, is there anything you'd particularly like me to convey to him, you know, because I was very sad that here was a very devoted couple who couldn't be together. And of course, I feel, you know, very sad for Ingrid and her loss now with Ernst's untimely demise. As we know, just on the 5th of August he died. Right. But apropos of that, actually, because I used to visit him in his ancestral home there, where I'd also visit some friends I knew, some society friends I happened to know in Pforzheim, which is near Baden-Baden and near where Ernst had his ancestral home, and where, in fact, he used to go to school in Pforzheim. And these people I took to meet Ernst, but it was, and they liked him very much because they were nervous, you know, German nervous of meeting anybody who would be interested in the Third Reich. And but afterwards they found him, as naturally, they found him a very good and kind fellow. But it was a shame, actually, and I regretted it. You know, you have to do things right there and then, you know, because I wanted to say to him what they said later. This woman said she knew someone who used to be responsible for taking toys and shoes to Auschwitz in order to set up these installations there, that they weren't from the victims, as we're told, but they were shipped there. And this man was one of the people responsible. I said, well, didn't anybody take his eyewitness? You know, you'd think somebody does something. And in the end, you think, well, if they haven't, you'll have to do it, which always amazes me. It's just the same when Irving rings me up from the prison and says, you've got to go and look after my family, this, that, and the other. And I think, well, there must be somebody else more suited, but there isn't. Nobody has taken any account of this man's, what the man said. So I was always wanting to see if I could get the person who knew this man to maybe tell him a bit more, to tell Ernst a bit more about this, and maybe Ernst could facilitate this in his field. You know, after all, I'm interested in religion, not so much as in, I mean, interested in the Holocaust as it's described because of Holocaustianity. Right. I am interested in religion and advertising. That is my field. So it's not somewhere that I would particularly want to go. And of course, I don't speak German. But I wanted to put Ernst onto this person and see if he could have followed it up, because clearly it would have been a very interesting thing for him to do. And I always thought, well, there's always time. One never knows what time one has.
Right. I want to just make a comment about that a lot of people might not know, but in Birkenau, okay, they had a place, it was called Canada, and
Yes.
that is where all the shoes and all the things that people had, they donated there. And you made a good point. A lot of these things came from the outside, and this is almost like Birkenau was almost like a Salvation Army.
Yes, that's
what
right.
it was like. So
right.
People think that all
depository for these things, yes.
And they don't understand that all this stuff was donated because the people on the outside knew that these people were in there and they didn't have anything or whatever. So they donated shoes, they donated clothes, and they just end up collecting there. Cost huge amounts of stuff. I mean, it just kept coming in. And so at the end of the war, they make it look like, look at all the people that came through this camp, because there's, mountains of clothing over there, when it wasn't really all the people's clothing that was in the camp. I just wanted to make that known to people, because most people don't know that.
That's true.
Yes, that's right. And here was a witness to it, and he was a very independent witness, because this woman was clearly nervous of even speaking or meeting Ernst, but anyway. So and these people were certainly not even curious about these things. So so I lost that chance, thinking that Ernst would always be alive forever, and
Right.
Yeah.
so, and one always thinks, well, later on. So I should tell you, it was just a minor thing in a sort of a way, but
Sure.
I have a kind of maybe a change of pace here, just slightly, or maybe a jump forward. I think I met you at the Sacramento Revisionist Conference, defunct Revisionist Conference in 2004.
yes.
And there isn't a great deal to tell about that one, I wouldn't think, because it was salvaged by the essentially the white nationalists and the Institute for Historical Review.
Oh, no, let me just tell you, put you at that time. It was salvaged by your former husband and myself.
Well, I think you were
Because
ahead.
we were the instigators, because
I believe it.
Right, because we rang up. I said, Paul, get on the phone and ring up the IHR, Mark Webber, and tell him that he's to stop these people from leaving. We're going to find anywhere, but we're not going to allow our predator to have the last word.
I remember that. Yeah.
That was the first time I'd ever made a public speech. I was on a talk tour with Paul across Canada.
That's right.
And we heard of this, and I said, Paul, this is not going to happen. This is the biggest conference they've ever gathered of international speakers to do with this issue. We must not allow them to go. And I did get very cross with Tobin, and I have said to his face, instead of waltzing around talking about these things and being a sort of a David Irving, he should have been on the ground there with that chap who was doing his best to put on a German nationalist sort of event. It was going to be a conference, but it was going to be surrounded by German national cooking and celebration of yes, a cultural thing. And it was going to be held in one of these gymnasiums.
I do remember that, Michelle. And it was largely, I don't like to use Yiddish terms, the chutzpah, but I know Ingrid does. And it really showed, I mean, it was almost like you were tired of it. And yes, Paul was instrumental in doing that. And I was able to watch how you kind of energized.
I even bullied him into it. I said, Paul, get on the phone. I said, first of all, do you know anybody there in America to stop this? And he said, well, I can only think of the IHR. I said, well, get on the phone. I didn't know Mark Webber. I said, just get on the phone to someone and stop those people leaving.
Yeah.
Because the tragedy was that I think it was a big mistake of Tobin. I have a lot of respect for Tobin in many ways. In this, because none of us are perfect. The point of the thing is that he needed to be on the ground there with that chap who was running it, because immediately he you know, when it was deliberately scuppered by the Jews, they rang up as soon as he'd bought all the food. Then they rang him and said, ha, 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 we knew all the time you weren't going to be able to rent this place. We just let you think so. Now you've wasted your money. You can't hold it. And so the poor chap tried to find another place because he wanted to do the cooking. He was looking for a place where he could do the catering. There, the Jews had already foreseen that and scuppered all of that. Yes. So he then cancelled it. But had Tobin been there with his experience, he should have already had plan B.
That's right.
No plan, because he was not on the ground. But anyway, so I said to Paul, we are not going to allow our predator to have the last word, because it weakens people's resolve to stand up. So finally, I said to Mark, I don't care what you find, we'll speak in a car park, anywhere, but we will have the last word, because we cannot build on people's resistance to this predatory behavior if we give them defeat. So we must hold it. It doesn't matter where we hold it. We have the last word. And sure enough, Mark did find, to Tobin's fury, because obviously there was a little bit rivalry there, this sports pavilion out of town.
Like a gym or something.
It was a gym, and it was the first time I'd ever given a speech. It was the first public speech I'd ever given. And there I met, you know, a few other people. I did meet that other chap with the ginger hair. What's his name? Who died not so long ago.
Edgar Steele.
Edgar Steele. Now, I was very impressed with Edgar Steele, but I was horrified at how easily, my speech was, I don't believe in anybody or anything 100%, and I don't recommend it. We should always be skeptical. And sure enough, after, and then prior to my speech, it was Edgar Steele, who I had a lot of respect for, but he actually said to the 150 people who were there, now look, I want you to get up, walk around your chair and sit down again. And do you know that the whole of that audience got up, except for me? They got up, walked around the chair and sat down again. And I thought, why did they do that? Because they trusted him. But just because somebody you know, this is not the way to proceed. And of course, you know, this was part of my little talk, my improvised talk, with criticizing the people who are doing that. But anyway, that was the first time I met Mark Webber and quite a number of other, Chuck Carlson, a few very good people that they're there. So I started to begin to find out about all these other people, and that there were all these people out there thinking as I did, but I'd never heard of them when I was. So, and as I say, in so many respects throughout this period of time, from 1997, or I think it must be, till the present, the best people I have ever met have been these people who are willing to be skeptical and to take historical source criticism seriously, to say there can be no exceptions to it. And, you know, so I am very much in awe of these people, because, you know, I've had minor, I mean, they've threatened to send me ricin in a get well card, you know, and my technician was able to trace who that was, because sometimes you can cover up your tracks in these internet things, and sometimes people don't bother. And he tracked it down to a person who used to be a settler, one of these occupiers of Israel, who now lives in Canada. And we found out who he was, and he called the Royal Mounties and Scotland Yard and said, what are you going to do about this? This is incitement to murder, isn't it? It's on the internet. And they both said, it's not important.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
So, but if I said something like that to somebody,
that's right. It's more reversed.
But what I'm saying, so they've ruined my livelihood. But okay, I can find another livelihood. They've attacked my property. They've done these things, but those things are minor compared to what they have done with so many of these people who simply say, we want the right of open debate. That is the principle of our Hellenic tradition. As I keep saying, I can't stand the Abrahamic tradition. I simply cannot stand it. I would accept that I'm psychologically Christian because of my upbringing. Not that I had a particularly Christian upbringing, but I have been in a culture that was psychologically Christian. Of course, it's not any longer. And I think the better part of it is it's Buddhism. And the Buddhism that I'm talking about is the same principle as in classical ballet training, that you have to be objective. You have to set aside your personal subjectivity, which is how I would interpret turn the other cheek, to listen to why anybody wants to slap you in the first place. Are they holding the mirror up genuinely to you, and could you learn from that, or are they being malicious? But you need to have a look at the issue objectively, to put yourself over there, and like any other subject, look at it objectively. And I think that is the quality of the revisionists at their best, and the idea of Christianity at its best. And I think that's where it comes from, this Buddhist idea. In fact, I do think Christian Lindner is probably correct about the connection between the New Testament and the Buddhist scriptures. But be that as it may, those qualities that really the Greeks taught us, the four inseparable virtues, which I've just said recently, Ursula Haverbeck, who's standing up for the right of her lawyers to submit evidential exhibits to prove her case, she is the embodiment of those four inseparable virtues. And they are, number one, temperance, and by which the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, meant measure, harmony, balance, a sense of proportion, as in an argument. Then there is justice, but of course unbiased. Then there's wisdom, but in the case of the Hellenic tradition, with scientific attitude, which is where the revisionists come in. And of course the fourth one is courage, but none of them are any good without the others. You need the four of them, and I really believe in them as a teacher, as a trained person in aesthetics, in various fields. That is what I believe that the revisionists try to stand for, and is why I admire them. Whether what their findings are correct or not, to me, is not. How the Germans dealt with their predator is not of interest to me particularly. I'm interested in our not following the guidelines for teaching the Holocaust in schools. And I put that when Robert Forreston asked me last year to be his sole defense witness in Paris. And I tried to tell the judge, because I was asked, because his trial is all about his appearance at the Tehran conference in 2006. And I also happened to have spoken at the trial in Tehran at 2006. My subject was the psychology of Holocaustianity. That was my subject. You'll see that on my website, thejewishrepublic.com. And because I was a witness there, Robert had asked me to be his sole witness to what he said and did at the conference. And so I was able to tell the judge, A, that Robert spoke English, not French, at the conference. He always preambles everything he speaks of because he's very witty. He always says that he's half Scots, half French, and that he always tells his half Scots. He always tells his half Scots not to allow his half French to listen to him, because his Scottish side is allowed free speech and objectivity, but his French side is denied. I'll just take a glass of water. So I think in his witty way, Robert states a very important condition there of free speech. And so I was able to tell the judge, A, that he only spoke for 10 minutes, no more than 20, because we were all supposed to be given only 10, maximum 20 minutes to speak. And I remember it very clearly, because the concept that I should be given the same length of time as Robert Forison, to me, was extraordinary. So I know full well that he wasn't able to deliver his paper, and he certainly wasn't able to read out his 20 words, his 20-word piece to the judge. Shall I read those 20 words?
Sure.
Well, because he says, I'm quoting Robert Forison, the alleged Hitlerite gas chambers and the alleged genocide of the Jews form one and the same historical lie, which has permitted a gigantic political and financial swindle, whose main beneficiaries are the State of Israel and international Zionism, and whose main victims are the German people, but not their leaders, and the Palestinian people in their entirety, end quote. And then I tried to go on with an interpreter. You had to have an interpreter to talk about the guidelines for teaching about the Holocaust. But unfortunately, the translator simply couldn't manage it, and he seemed to be giving the impression that we were talking about guides at Auschwitz rather than guidelines. He couldn't cotton on to, even though I'd shown him on the back of my DVD, Jading Opinions, where it quotes it. And so I'll quote it to you, because that was what I was telling the horrified French judge, who could hardly believe his ears. And I said, I'm quoting from page 11 of the International Guidelines for Teaching about the Holocaust, which came from the Stockholm International 2000 Forum and was reiterated again in 2007, and is to this day still the guidelines internationally for teaching. And it says, and I quote, care must be taken not to give a platform for deniers. This is what they will only call historical revisionists, and historical revisionism should have no exceptions. Anyway, that's my so it should not give a quote for deniers, a platform for deniers, or seek to disprove the denier's position through normal historical debate and rational argument. End quote. So the teachers of history in our schools, which are based on the classical Greek tradition of the four virtues, where you use wisdom with scientific attitude, etc., are to teach this particular aspect of history with deliberately to shun normal historical debate and rational argument. This, to me, is, as an educationalist, is an outrage.
Now, where did that come from again, Michelle? What was that in?
Page 11 of, you can look it up on the internet there pretty easily, of the International Guidelines, the Stockholm 2000 Forum for teaching, how to teach the Holocaust in schools.
very important. Yeah.
I mean, it's very, very important. And that's what I told the judge. And that's what there was another event when Bishop Williamson, the Society for St. Pius X, the people who are opposing the Vatican II Congress, where Christianity was Judaized, and now Christ is regarded as an anti-Semite, and the warnings are taken out of Christendom, which are the beneficial. Both Islam and Christianity, two role models, warn us about the predatory nature of Judaism. But those, in the case of Roman Catholicism, has been taken out, and it certainly has been taken out two of the Christian Zionists with the Schofield Concordance Bible. So when pardon me, when the Bishop Williamson, the Roman Catholic Bishop Williamson, was thrown out of his seminary in Argentina and sent back to England. Oh heavens, what was I going to tell you? Oh dear, so many things to tell you. What was the point I was going to make there?
You were talking about Bishop Williamson and the change of, as a result of Schofield and how the Christians look at.
Yes, thank you very much, Diane. Yes, that's right. So the BBC had asked me to go to do
Michelle, if you want to just take a break right now, we can edit.
I'll just take a sip.
I mean, because we can edit all that out.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
So don't worry about that. Anything that's,
Yes,
of like that. If you want to take a minute break, go ahead. Just have something to drink and.
No, that's okay. So I'll just start with a proper sentence so you can connect it better. So when Bishop Williamson is thrown out of his seminary in Argentina and sent back to England, on that occasion, the BBC asked me for an interview. They come to my house, and in the van outside, in their van, I give an interview about that. And on the same, on the opposite side is Greville Janner. Greville Janner was the head of the Holocaust, pardon me, the Holocaust educational fund or whatever. Of course, after he realizes that I have quoted from the guidelines, he goes totally berserk. And on the same day, the BBC World Service also asked me. Of course, they've never asked me ever again. I mean, "Don't Bring Lulu" is the name of the song. But they asked me to be on this call-in show with Deborah Lipstadt. And the call-in show was called "Why Can't We Talk About the Holocaust?" And of course, I am trying then to read the guidelines, to quote from them. And of course, I am stopped by the professor. I am stopped by Professor Lipstadt, of course, who doesn't want me to read those out. She's saying that all I'm doing is spewing, her favorite word, spewing, hatred and all that kind of stuff. And, so behind the scenes, the BBC are saying to me, "Please, I think thank you very much for your cooperation. Bye-bye." I said, "No, it's not bye-bye until I've been allowed to complete this quote, because that is what your show is about. And if you're not going to allow me to complete this sentence that I'm quoting, then your show is a sham." So I shamed them into allowing me to finish. But of course, Lipstadt went berserk about that as well. So this quote should be common knowledge. We should make it as common knowledge as possible, because clearly it is an outrage. Clearly, this part of history is being taught as a religion.
Yeah.
And
we call the Holocaust the Holocaust cult. I mean, that's what it is. I mean,
there's no question. There's no question about that. And that is what I'm particularly interested in, because I'm interested in the psychology of religion, because I'm interested in the mispackaging, the swindle, the ideas that are not beneficial to us, and the fact that we have made a very big mistake pardon me, over the millennia in not identifying Judaism as predatory.
Right.
It's not simply an enemy. It's not simply deceivers, the vipers, the synagogue of Satan, and all these phrases that we have in the New Testament to warn us, and they have similar ones in the in Islam. They have similar ones. It's the issue is that a predator, an enemy, you can eventually make friends with, you can negotiate with, but you cannot with a predator. And if you name and describe things correctly, you won't make that mistake. And unfortunately, we have not called Judaism what it is. It's an anti-Gentile predatory creed.
Right. Michele, let me just give you a break here. Just hold on for a minute, and I'll just talk for a minute. So yeah. We're going to probably be. I mean, we could talk to you for hours. I can see that, but I just want to get a couple of things out there so people can know more about you and your websites and things where they can find where you maybe put stuff on the internet or whatever. So first of all, what is your website that people can go look at and see what you're talking about?
Well, the first thing to say to you is that when I produced Jailing Opinions, the DVD, someone liked it so much that he started to promote it. And the website is called Jailing, Jailing, opinions.com. It's not my website, but it is based on my book, my DVD, which he wanted to promote. So you find out a lot about me there, because he says, why would in an international television commercial actress be interested in historical revisionism? It's an interesting question. Yeah. And there he takes it from there. So you'll find out quite a lot from there.
Okay.
Our website is called jewishrepublic.com, because I believe that there is an alternative, peaceful solution to the lunacy that we are tolerating. And that's why I would take exception to Greg Johnson's attitude toward Israel, but that perhaps another long topic. But it was the late great Colonel Gaddafi who was going to help me achieve my campaign, because I pointed out to him when I went into Tripoli to speak there that if we could get every member of the United Nations, though we know that the United Nations is a Jewish initiative, just like before that the League of Nations and so on, nevertheless, it could call for a resolution and therefore do for the first time the first real justice in the world by resolving to have the first Jewish homeland, which is Birubijan, I'll tell you about that later perhaps, instead of the criminal second homeland that doesn't need to be. Perhaps I'll have a break and I'll tell you in a minute. Yeah. So that's the website.
Okay.
jewishrepublic.com.
Okay. All right. I just want to make a comment here. I think, I don't know if you've done it, but I mean, I really think you got to write a book.
Another one.
I mean, you really, I mean, I really didn't realize that there's a book here. You know what I mean? I mean, I'm trying to interview you. And it's like, I have so many questions I could keep asking. I mean, I could probably talk to you for hours. But I really think you should write a book, and then, talk about your life, talk about, how you came in contact with all the revisionists, and then get into your thoughts of religion and all those type of things. I mean, you really have a workings of an excellent book, and I really
it's an expanded monograph if you want to look at it that way.
Yeah.
Well, I've had the very, very good fortune of bit by bit coming across these amazing researchers. And though each one of them I might criticize for this way or that way or the other way, they are all, for me, exceptional people with the qualities of those four inseparable classical virtues.
Right.
And so they are, for me, it's been extraordinary that I've just had the luck of somehow, bit by bit, coming across pretty much most of them. So I guess I probably have some, inside information, I guess, that's perhaps some people haven't heard and so on.
Yeah.
And I've come across it in a rather unusual way, given my own curiously expertise in a field that you wouldn't expect to be related to historical revisionism, i.e. advertising and Judaism.
Right. You might want to think about interviewing us at some point in time because of we kind. I know you probably don't agree with this, but we come from a biblical background, but it's not the biblical background that you've been exposed to.
No, not at all.
And you might be interested to hear that religion, this is what we feel anyway, the religion that's being thrown at you out there and that you've been experienced, especially Christianity, okay, is not what's being presented. Okay, so if you ever really wanted to hear the real base of Christianity, what it really is, and not what is being presented by the Catholic Church, the Protestant churches, the Zionists.
Well, certainly not what's being presented now, because we know it's totally occupied.
Absolutely. That's the point. Yeah.
So we kind of feel, because you brought out your 4 points. See, in the Bible has its more than 4 points. In the book of 1 Corinthians, it says that the fruits of the Spirit is love, joy, kindness, goodness, mildness, self-control. There's 9 of them, okay? And they actually tie in with yours. So just to let you know. All right.
Yeah, well, I don't know there's scientific interest in that, you see. But I tell you, I would very much like to do that, because I would like to talk about Dr. Christian Lindner's theories.
Right.
He's the philologist from Denmark.
Well, maybe there could be another interview with you, because that's a whole different topic, and I like talking about that type of information here, dealing
in this
with
context. We're not fearing the so-called Judeo-Christian flashback, because we don't buy into. In fact, Jim into the Holocaust. Jim has been. Mark Weber described Jim as a publicist, and I am an advocate. I'm a Third Reich advocate, and I bristle at any negative connotation to the Third Reich, because it comes from the advertising, as you say.
Right.
It's how it's been packaged. So
Right.
I reject it outright. And Jim passes on information that he has ingested, and he puts it out there as well. So we're not inventing anything. We're merely, we don't feel we should invent the wheel. Germar Rudolph, Forason, numerous people have done the groundwork on this. It's our point and our purpose to be able to publicize further their discoveries.
Well, your task is an extraordinary one, because you are trying simply to let people know what these people have discovered. That's what you're doing. It's not a publicist in the sort of vulgar way of it. You're simply trying to get through the barrier which is stopping anybody from knowing what these guys have said. And that's the same thing that I'm doing, you see.
Yes.
Right. So it's good. It's a good situation here.
Open debate is what we think we are entitled to as humans. But there's, what I would like to understand, and why I would love to to understand German.
Yeah, well,
even though I have to say those the Heidelberg professor said that considering I don't read German, I seem to understand Wagner a good deal more than most of the people who write about him. But and perhaps that's true of the Third Reich as well. But what I would like to understand, and don't because I can't read it, is what Adolf Hitler had in mind for the psychological, metaphysical idea of his Germania. Right. I mean, he was preparing his people to deal with the onslaught of the reaction, i.e. he was making soldiers of them, and they had to be hard as steel and all the rest of it. But that wasn't simply the end game. That was the preparation for trying to combat the predator.
Right. And I'm very much interested in that too.
What was the ultimate metaphysical higher being that he had in mind? Right. That's what I'd like to. And I think the fact that he tried to and succeeded in getting people to overcome the individual vanity and greed for themselves, but to cooperate in the extraordinary way that they did and feel good about it when they did it, would only be one step. What was his ultimate goal in believing that he could try and make the human a higher human? And I would dearly love to understand what he meant, because I think he meant something there. Right. Yeah. And would have led us to that.
Right. And so maybe we can that could be another discussion point we can start out with next time. Dealing with what. Remember, this was just the beginning. What Hitler was starting, and it didn't even get close to getting going. I mean, it got stopped before it even got going. So
and how extraordinary for 12 years what was achieved.
Right. Yeah. So that would be another discussion for you. How's that?
Another thing also, Michelle, I want you to discuss perhaps in the next segment, which I'm hoping will be not too far, is what you did on the jailing opinions and telling films about like your interviews with the rabbis and what they told you and how you presented Theodore Herzl.
That's very important because they said, and I have them on record, they said the Zionists needed Jewish blood to barter with the nations afterwards to get their HQ.
Okay. Yeah. All right, so that's a good thing we could talk about too. So Michelle, listen, I know we've been talking a lot, and
we have a break, 5 minutes or something.
Oh. Yeah. So your voice is kind of having a tough deal.
Got to get you a break.
Yeah, we got to give you a break. We're going to cut you a break here, but we
you
really
don't get
enjoyed
in ballet training. You don't get breaks in ballet training.
Well, you don't have to talk in ballet training either. So I know that you're trying to cross over from that into other areas, but sometimes there are limitations. And I know you're talking about the discipline and the denial of the physical pain, because obviously you went through that. But at some point you have to kind of cut yourself a break, and we're prepared to do that. You don't have to take that. We'll give it to you.
Right.
That.
Thank you. I take anything that's kind nowadays.
I know, right?
well, Michelle, listen,
I'm glad to know you as well.
We'll wrap this up now, but you're an extraordinary woman, and I didn't realize how in depth there was the depth of you. I mean, you have so much to offer and talk about. And
we want to get your story out
there. My goodness, I mean,
I'm generally just considered and expected to be merely the model, is what I call myself.
We'll start from there.
Yes, so people are a little bit surprised, and certainly the enemy is, because the enemy in Dr. Zuroff, the head of the Wiesenthal Center, has described me as very dangerous.
Yeah.
And the reason is because he says I put a pretty face on an ugly movement. But what I actually do is, it's a pretty aging face now, but the point of the thing is what I do is put a normal face, and that's what they don't like. They don't like a normal face, and they don't like people getting together.
Yeah,
and I
that's
right.
Right.
Be able to get people together, and that is not what they like at all.
Right.
So. But how are you wrap up this session now.
Well,
Yes.
okay. Well, we're just gonna wrap it up saying that we appreciate talking to you, Michele, and we're gonna continue this on in another discussion with you about the other topic that you brought up. And I just want to conclude to say that this is Rizoli TV, and I'm Jim Rizoli. This is Diane King, and again, we will talk to you another time. All right. Thank you now.
Bye, Michele.